Yeah, there was a period of a few weeks there where we were just every week. It felt like we were exchanging a text back and forth, being like, "If you want to, we could record this week," and just praying that the other person would be like, "I got too much shit."
I definitely sent a few messages like that. Yeah, last week there was one that, oh yeah, maybe I could potentially do tomorrow, maybe.
Yeah, like I'm really sorry, but oh no, if we have to.
I think we've both been equally busy.
Yeah, a lot of stuff going
on. It is nice to be back. Nice to be doing it again.
Yeah, we're back. Feels like a lot has happened because originally in the past few weeks we were banning about the idea of reading a few things about the current war with Iran, right? War on Iran. And I feel like if we hadn't done it immediately after I suggested it, it wouldn't have worked because we were going to do it last week and it was about an article that was written like the day before I suggested it, a couple articles, but then, within a few days it was like the situation completely changed and our conversation just would have been useless. Yeah, what are you going to do? I was just telling you that we've had a bunch of fuel protests out here because gasoline has been, and diesel specifically, have been really hard to come by for people in Ireland. And we've had the kind of like, as I said, the Jimmy Carter-esque, which is perhaps an unfair way to describe them, but like, lines outside of gas stations and stuff, people trying to get gas stations closed, protests and stuff. But it's interesting. We literally just had this conversation, so I won't go over it too much more again. But all of these protests, the far right have been pretty active at here in Ireland, where it's like a bunch of farmers and haulage guys and, like truck drivers, stuff like that, have been protesting and blockading refineries and ports and roads and all that stuff. And it's been kind of weird because, like, I was just saying to you how frustrating it's been watching loads of left groups, communist parties, stuff like that, like fall over themselves trying to be like, these are working class people. We need to be these, the fuel prices and lack of fuel, like this affects working class people. We need to be supporting these protests. And if the fucking fascists are there, it's only because they're well organized and stuff like that. And it's been pissing me off so much. One, because it's like, there's the fossil fuel side of it, which we'll leave to one side because obviously like everybody needs to use gas to get to work, whatever. But then there's also the part of it where it's just like, there's just no class analysis of these people out here. And it's been like, I wandered down to one of these protests and it's like, there were very few working people there who weren't just fascists. Like there were a lot of the anti-immigrant crowd were there, who a lot of those people are unfortunately proles. But most of the people in the trucks, like they're like petty bourgeois farmers. And it's like these truck drivers and stuff. And so it was very disappointing to see a lot of socialists like fall over themselves trying to act like there wasn't an extreme element of class to these protests. But, it raised some interesting questions about what a prole is. It's like if you own a small holding, if you own your own means of production, are you still a prole, even though you're only exploiting yourself? Like all of this interesting stuff. So, but having said that, all the protests just left fucking bad taste in my mouth. So be lucky you don't have them over there right now.
Yeah. No, I haven't seen any signs of protests like that, or haven't really experienced any kind of knock-on effect. I'm not a driver, so there have been like increases in the price of fuel and stuff like that. But the sort of promised economic collapse that is coming hasn't happened yet. But yeah, it's interesting. Like I haven't really thought about it hugely. I mean, there is an argument to be said. Well, some kind of alliance with petty bourgeois elements in society as part of I don't know, a tactical alliance that might be useful. Is like having a line, having a way of propagating ideas to people with that more diverse class positions, recognizing that we all have particularly diverse. Nobody's got a pure class position, right? But there is a dangerous tendency, I suppose, to default to the kind of like cultural definitions of class and try and describe people as working class predicated on some cultural attributes that they have rather than an economic analysis, which might be something that's you're recognizing as happening here. And then also having like a sort of sounds like they've got a very kind of pure pluralistic approach where it's like as you say, this sort of like the far right is only appealing to these people. They're only part of this protest because they're more organized and they're there. And if we were more organized, some sort of abstract definition of organization, we could win them over to our side. But not really looking very tactically at what the actual political potentialities are of this. Perhaps, I don't know. That's
Yeah,
my
I mean, I don't
musings
even
anyway.
like whatever they would be. You know what I mean? Like, it's very hard to imagine at the moment what that would even look like. Like, opposition parties like Sinn Féin, it's really easy for them, I think, because they can just be like, look how much Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are fucking this up. Oh, God, if we were in power, we wouldn't be fucking this up that badly. And because of that, they're able to just appeal to everybody. But it's like, if you're a socialist, it's a really hard argument to make. Not the least of which because everybody out here has like, multiple farmers in their family, you know what I mean? So it's like, you don't just want to be telling people, fuck them. And also, like, even if there was a revolution, like today, it's like, well, unless you're able to immediately somehow
Even as
take
much
over
as you
all of these
might
people's
want to.
land. Yeah, yeah,
As much as
exactly.
you might
So,
want to do that, perhaps you shouldn't.
yeah, exactly. But, I mean, like, everybody, again, I also don't drive out here. So it's, again, a lot of this just passed me by until I suddenly ran into one of these protests. But, yeah, proles drive too. And it sucks for them. It's just, most of the people who are at these protests weren't like, for like proles, it'd be like, fuck, I can't get gas, and gas is a bit more expensive. But for these like farmers and for these like haulage drivers and stuff, like truck drivers, like for them, it's like, oh, my business doesn't function. I can't, in some cases exploit the laborers that work for me. In other cases, like, I just can't fill up my big rig, or I can't fill up my, 20 John Deere tractors or whatever. But like, it's a tricky one. It's just interesting. It's like, this is such a, we were talking about inflation on an episode relatively recently. We were talking about, when oil is one of the things where the price jumps up dramatically, about how that just affects everything in terms of prices. And it was just interesting. I would have expected there to be more of a subsistence struggle element to perhaps maybe create a bit of a transition to our reading to this war than we're currently seeing, at least here in Ireland. And it's, places East Asia, Southeast Asia, where they import a lot of their oil from the Gulf, and Iran. Subsistence struggles there, I would imagine, are kicking off, with a lot of vigor, especially like in the Philippines prior to there being an agreement a few weeks ago to get oil into the country. But out here, it's just taken a very weird petty bourgeois angle to protesting. It's just like, aesthetically, it really reminds me of the COVID caravan shit in Canada. It's very strange. It's like, wow, an actual world historic crisis, and then it's just manifesting as like a bunch of fucking like, dudes on John Deere's blocking traffic. It's like, with like Irish flags fucking flying. It's like, oh my God.
It sounds to me like it's just lots of like right wing coded or right wing aligned groups taking advantage of a situation. So, there is a sort of generalizable crisis of in some level of subsistence that could be applied to anyone and may well emerge in different social situations. But like the people that are best able to leverage it to their advantage are groups that already exist and are potentially like right aligned, I suppose. So it might not be more than these are, might not be so much that these are neutral actors who are being influenced by a much more well-organized right-wing group of political activists, but rather that these are political movements that are already right-coded, which are taking advantage of the situation. I mean, we've had farmers' protests in this country recently, and it's quite hard to not see them as like
scum. No, I didn't say scum. I'm not saying scum.
No.
But it was so funny. I mentioned that because I mentioned before I moved out here to somebody, I moved from England to Ireland, and I mentioned to somebody like, I've seen farmers protest before in England, and they were like, landowners in England are like a completely different thing to landowners in Ireland, where it's like they're landowners, they're not farmers. They're like, they got their Land Rovers, they got their little Union Jack socks, like, that's like it's not a different class actually, but it's like kind of a different class, you know what I mean? Aesthetically, at least, quantitatively maybe, but yeah. Anyway, subsistence struggles, Dan, and petty bourgeois struggles, they're going on all around us. You want to tell us what we read?
This week we read an essay by Phil Neel. And what's it called? A theory of the party? The theory of party? Just theory of the party?
Theory of the party.
Right. which I've heard about and then came across recently surfing around the internet. And yeah, I really enjoyed this. I feel like maybe we left off with Phil Neel having read Riot Strike Riot, and may have come away with some, I don't know, maybe it was an accurate representation of how he ends that book, or maybe it was a somewhat
You mean Hinterland?
oh, is it Hinterland? Of course, yeah,
Hinterland,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
well, maybe I'm getting my
Your ultra leftist confused.
my ultra leftist mixed up. Yes, correct. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, then you correct me if I'm wrong. That my recollection is that Hinterland ends with a sort of appeal to left wing political formations based on the commune and sort of like a. But yeah, no, maybe that's maybe I'm misremembering. Maybe
I think
yeah.
it's I think it's very like I think the Joshua Clover stuff. That's who you're thinking of,
Yeah,
and I feel like his stuff was definitely like a precursor to the kind of like, you know, Jasper Burns kind of communist action stuff, as well as the Hinterland stuff that we've read, because it is like a recognition of these different types of struggles, and yeah, a kind of like in no, I'm getting their names confused. In Joshua Clover's stuff, he is very much like seems to privilege commune style. You know, it's going to happen whether you want it to or not. So you know that kind of thing. Whereas, yeah, communes definitely seem like they play an important role here, but in more of a like maybe I don't know, very much communizer coded like oh fuck, now I can't think of the actual word. It's like, is it abjection? Is it like it's kind of like a negation
Commiseration?
of, you know,
Like,
immiseration,
yeah.
abjection, negation, kind of a like logical outcome of almost like quantity into quality style, like dialectical analysis of these kind of like subsistence struggles going on in an age of, you know, capitalist crisis that it doesn't seem like it's going to be able to pull itself out of, where they kind of, yeah, necessarily spill into commune style negation
Well,
of capitalism.
I'm glad of that clarification, because I was about to um, attribute to Phil Neel things that he has not said, perhaps, but also, it does make this piece actually more theoretically coherent with um, uh, the other essays of his that we've read. I actually really enjoyed this. I thought that it was really quite useful. I thought that it actually is attempting to answer some things that we've struggled with in the past, just in relation to like, I mean, it's the big question, isn't it? You know, like how ought communists act, but also is it possible for some kind of organizing by communists to create historical situations advantageous to sort of a change in the mode of production toward a communal socialist one, or is it purely down to historical events, and are we just sort of riding a wave of history and we're sort of waiting for the right conditions to emerge, and in those situations it might demand just sort of like a degree of quietism from communists and a patience and a waiting for um, those sort of like correct circumstances to come about. I feel like we approached some answers to this question when we were reading that Anton Pannekoek book recently, and sort of recognizing that there is a sort of a less negative version of council communism that says, well, there is practical organizing to be done by communists outside of revolutionary times. And I think similarly, this piece was sort of circling similar questions, I suppose, as like, what is the movement history of capitalism, of the revolutionary sort of the revolutionary circumstances that emerge within the unfolding of the history of capitalism, and yeah, what is the relationship to that versus like conscious organizing that's done by revolutionaries? And I really quite liked the balance, but also there are tensions here, and there's a lot of working through the problem and approaching it from different ideas. But yeah, a lot of things that are very agreeable to me, I think.
Mm. Yeah, I'm glad you kind of bring that up first. That kind of relationship between like broadly defined, you know, quote unquote organizing and activism and like the class movement as a whole. Because I did feel like this really kind of just like took certain kind of like maybe at first left communist and then kind of more ultra lefty stuff to its logical conclusion in terms of like trust in the working class, and that eventually these struggles will take on a communist character somehow. And it's a really good way of like taking that for granted, as well as like still recognizing, again, as you say, that like the quietism that so much of these kind of like groups get accused of is really just not correct at all. Like, you know, I think we came across that when we did workers' councils, like you said, where it's like, okay, yeah, that they're not actually just advocating for like just sitting on your hands doing nothing. And honestly, like so much of a materialist analysis, like a Marxist analysis, is recognizing what's possible in certain times and what isn't. And, you know, everybody recognizes that, including like social democrats, even when they try to pretend that they don't, because, you know, there's like the quantitative approach to building the mass party, which is, you know, the strategy of patience, which is just a kind of another word for like, you know, not quietism necessarily, but like recognizing what can be done and what can't be done in certain historical moments. I really did appreciate that. And it's interesting. Like, I think the thing that I took from at least the beginning of this was a really kind of interesting approach to that kind of quantitative approach. He doesn't call it quantitative like approaches to organizing, to like kind of communist organizing, but I think that is kind of what he's referencing in more like social democratic and maybe more orthodoxy, traditional, I guess I should say, like Marxist approaches to organizing, rooted in kind of like 20th century norms, quote unquote, where organizing is, like I said, like a quantitative thing where you're trying to get a certain, you know, once we get X number of people to join the party, once we're able to get X number of people to, you know, get involved with the union, then it'll reach a tipping point and we'll all be able to kind of like ... question mark, question mark, question mark, get to communism. But here there's a much more like kind of, I'm probably misusing these words, but like there is a more qualitative approach to what's possible, where it's like you recognize that certain historical trends, certain crises, certain tendencies within capitalism itself. And, you know, again, like you said, like we saw this in Riot Strike Riot, like certain long form, certain short form tendencies, like create opportunities for organizing. And that's kind of when you really have to put the pedal to the metal in terms of like trying to get involved with what the working class is doing and trusting that it is going in a coherent direction and trying to kind of do a cybernetics-y kind of steersmanship on it. But yeah, we'll get into kind of more about what that means more concretely, because I'm speaking very much in like abstract terms here. But I did really approach the kind of like anti-quantitative approach to organizing, which is just like it's possible at any time. You just have to get organized in a very abstract, broad sense, and you just kind of have to get in there and get people to join the party. This is kind of, you know, it has much more trust in the class itself, and it recognizes, I think, in a way that a lot of socialisty stuff doesn't, which is that like organizers are also part of the class, you know, which is like an interesting way of thinking about it. Should be kind of obvious, but yeah, I enjoyed it too.
Yeah, it does feel like this I guess revolutionary process, this process that leads to the growth of the party and therefore leads toward revolution, sort of starts with a moment of revolt, potentially starts with some kind of like mass political moment, something which is potentially spontaneous perhaps. But I think maybe there's a version of this dichotomy between the necessity for sort of radical politics to emerge from some spontaneous moment where you can maybe I've fallen into the trap in the past of seeing it as something negative, of seeing it as something almost random and spontaneous, whereas I feel like Phil Neel here is starting his process with something similar, but rather than like a sort of slightly random, ephemeral, out of nowhere, spontaneous moment, what he's actually describing is the creativity of the working class itself. Like the revolt is almost like a creative moment, something which, you know, when we talk about like the proletariat, like liberating itself because of its like, particular capacities because of its sort of size and its knowledge base and its understanding of how the world works. What's actually being represented here is a fidelity to the creativity of the proletariat, and a sort of commitment to the idea that like there is wisdom in the masses. There's wisdom in the crowd. There is wisdom in like seemingly chaotic moments, but what's emergent is something new, something positive, but it's sort of like it's born out of resistance and its fidelity to that moment, which is what is the sort of the beginning point of this process of party formation, or I guess to some extent party in this case is sort of cyclical, so there's like it rises and it falls to some extent, so maybe it's the beginning of a ascendant phase of party creation, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it's good to you mention that because like when we get into, I think here in a sec, talking about what those kind of like cyclical parties are and these three kind of different party distinctions that he makes, like he gets into kind of talking about dividing lines that need to be set up. And he calls them very ecumenical in terms of like dividing lines of what makes a communist organizer like a communist. What are they doing to like actually advocate for a classless society, right? And one of the most important things that he mentions is just like, you need to not have this hoity-toity, stick up your nose like attitude towards the masses and the actions that they undertake, like exactly like what you're saying, like if there's anybody involved in like communist organizing who acts like, but did they really need to burn down the police precinct in Minnesota? It's like, okay, that is a strict dividing line. And it's funny, it's like a very interesting one compared to like the McNary dividing lines that we've come across before. It's like, when you put it as simply as this, is just like you need to trust the class and you need to like not stick up your nose at the class. It's like, yeah, that totally makes sense. It's like when we talk about revolt, we're not talking about something like easy and nice and calm. It's like there's a recognition here that, when the class's back is up against the wall, it's going to act like anybody would, and it's what we're actively trying to create is a revolutionary break with society. So it's like, in that sense, they throw a brick through the window, there's no like pearl clutching that should go on, right?
Mm-hmm. But at the same time, that's not the whole process. That's not the revolution. That's sort of as a momentary, moment of resistance that
an event.
It's it contains the kernel of something, but is it? What do you do with that? Where do you go from there? And quite often, it's almost like it's interesting that this process actually seemingly begins with the sort of like the fading of that spontaneous moment and then the reckoning with it in the aftermath kind of thing. And that's what creates these kind of like partisans of that moment who are sort of form the nascent like real world political parties, real world political organizations that sort of commit themselves to making some kind of intervention. But then they've got to work out how to relate to the sort of like the sort of broader mass of the proletariat, I guess. Then you get this sort of distinction between political organization as we recognize it. Maybe we call it like vanguard organizations or like more developed class elements or something. But there's almost a sort of like withdrawing from history of that particular event, but a sort of reckoning with it.
And trying your best not to become reactionary, right? Because that's kind of what he says. It's like, the class, like, is constantly changing in its environment that it's in and in its attitude towards that environment and its actions and what is possible and what isn't possible. And, again, we'll get into the kind of formal party, communist party, historical party stuff here in a second. But like when you try to create like a formal organization that captures that energy frequently, it's like, oh, now the attitudes have just changed, which is why you can't really have this kind of like, I know it all attitude towards communist organizing because it'll just come across as reactionary to the class. And who I think does a really excellent job of, I think, showing what this concretely is like in a revolutionary environment is Mike Duncan's The Revolutions podcast, where he frequently will use like a like primary sources from the days before and the days of like revolutions to kind of talk about like Robespierre's attitudes really didn't change all that much until he took power. He was just considered a radical and then he was considered a centrist because of the way, just like history played itself out and this rebellion played itself out. And it's like, it's the same for everyone. It's like the same for the Bolsheviks. Like suddenly just one day they were the reasonable people who, well, their like attitudes were the ones that seemed possible. Whereas for like the several decades before that, it wasn't, so it's, I appreciate the kind of like dynamic attitude towards party building or towards like party attitudes. I don't want to say programs because programs is kind of like a bad word in this, but like towards attitudes, I guess, as communists that you need to have towards the class and to kind of recognize that you're in a dynamic environment and you can't treat it as something static, right? There are a few, I don't know, there are a few things maybe to get to before we do the kind of 3-party thing. There's a lot of familiar syntax in this piece in terms of like sigils and, multitudity and stuff like that, which I really appreciated. The sigil thing, maybe you can help me kind of understand it, because my understanding was in this piece, this idea of the sigil is like a form or maybe an action that kind of taps into this underlying current of constant antagonism that bubbles up and then gets eclipsed and then bubbles up again in against capitalism that the proletariat always has. And the sigil is kind of like a broadly defined form or action that is able to tap into that and make it seem possible. Kind of just seemed like it was the communist action thing, maybe from that endnotes piece that we read a long time ago. I'm not sure.
I don't think I, come away with a good understanding of the sigil.
Well, actually, what we should probably do is maybe we should just talk about the 3 parties first, because I feel like to talk about any of the other things, we're going to need to get to that. The historical parties, okay, again, I'm going to kick this back to you because I think I was a little bit confused too. The historical party stuff, it seems like it is this recognition that there is a broadly defined antagonism towards capitalism that exists in the proletariat class all throughout capitalism. Is that broadly true, you think?
Yeah. I quite liked this distinction. It's like I always quite liked the way communists and Marx in particular talk about the party as this sort of like almost singular thing. And I never really quite had a good language to understand it or describe it or to differentiate the party as the singular historical communist party from, any particular fixed instantiation of that, whether it's like, the German Social Democrats or the Russian Communist Party or something. But yeah, there's this sort of like, I guess at the end of this essay, this sort of tripartite sort of like description of different instantiations of the Communist Party, and it's almost like a sort of like a historical trajectory, right? And I actually quite appreciated this idea of the historical party. For, as you say, it's sort of like Phil Neel talks about it, sort of like invariant qualities. Like there are some invariant structural things about capitalism that mean that the same dynamics always exist, the same class tensions are always going to be there, and as a result, the same sort of like potentiality for like communist resistance to the capitalist status quo is always going to be there as a possibility so long as capitalism exists. So there is this kind of like ever present potentiality, I suppose. There's a point where he talked about it as kind of like the unconscious of the proletariat, or the unconscious of the communist movement. It doesn't necessarily like have a fixed form, but it's I don't know, always there as a potentiality. And then that this second phase is this like okay, how does that coalesce? Okay, so that coalesces itself into a series of specific communist parties, of which none can be the singular. they're all like this, coming back to what you're talking before about the sort of multitudinal nature of this, which is something I really quite appreciate the use of that language to ward us away from becoming too singular, too fixed, too thinking at too grand a scale, right? It's always worth remembering, I guess, that any movement or any entity of any kind is composed of smaller elements, and this sort of communist movement is composed of a multitude of different communist parties. And it's important to say, I suppose, at this stage, that this doesn't necessarily mean self-defined communist parties. This doesn't mean a group of people who, you know, sit together and write a political program and go and sort of like propagandize it to the proletariat. And in some respects, that would be like a somewhat sort of descendant. That would be that would be representative of a decline of a more pure moment, where what you actually have is people responding to an event, recognizing the novelty of it, working in its shadow to sort of like advance a communist politics, even if they don't recognize that's what they're doing. They're advancing a collectivist or a anti-capitalist or a collectivist politic in whatever aspect of social organizing they're doing, kind of thing. So I quite one of the I'll stop in a minute, but like one of the strongest things in SSA for me were like this combination of a familiar set of language around parties, around programs, around organization, around proper names, around tactics and strategy, and then also this very complementary mixing in of language that I associate with, I suppose we'll say, like left communist politics, or multitude, or things like that, like things that remind us to not get too dogmatic, I suppose, in how we understand a political party or communist party, what
Yeah.
we understand it to be, I guess.
Yeah, I really appreciate you kind of clarifying all that for me. And I think that last part of what you're saying is, I think, really important, because it's like there's this element of it where it's exactly what you're saying. Like a lot of the quote unquote formal parties can maybe actually come across as quite reactionary because they're not actually speaking to anything real. Like one of the things at the beginning of this essay that Neel talks about is like, what is actually being offered to working people by so many of these groups that are espousing organization for organization's sake in a very abstract way. And he's saying, not a lot, actually. But then there's also the reverse of that, which I found really interesting when he's talking about the formal party, which is what you're saying. Like, you might not realize you're a formal party. A formal party could just be a couple people, undertaking a communist action or whatever, to use verbiage from like a similar, writer, or like, it could be an organizing committee. It could be this, it could be that. It's like anything that kind of coheres, with an intent to kind of further these struggles. I thought it was really interesting. And I really liked his use of the word ephemeral here, because so often it's like, you speak to anyone in these sects, it's like, oh yeah, sure, there have been a trillion different, splits from the group that we split from, but we're the ones that actually hold the red thread to this original, Trotskyist group, which was actually a Leninist group, which actually was just Marx, you know what I mean? And it's like the use of the word ephemeral just totally blows all of that away. And it makes a point where it's like, if you're in an organization where you expect it to just constantly be around and to hold this line and to, hope against hope that you're going to be the party that leads everybody to communism, like, if it all falls apart, it's like it's kind of fine. It's like, you can't really expect these things to not be ephemeral. And I think just the appreciation of that, I think, goes a long way, or the understanding of that goes a long way to kind of like a coherent systems approach to party organizing, or just to organizing in general. Because it's like, yeah, if you're organizing around specific concrete aims, you would expect what you're doing to be ephemeral, right? Like, instead of trying to have this lineage, like, yeah,
we can probably draw quite a lot of, I mean, you have done there, but draw quite a lot of sort of historical examples here. Like the failure of the Russian Revolution was perhaps the moment when the Russian Communist Party under Lenin had to declare itself the party, and sort of like, for whatever correct or incorrect reason, had to suppress other political movements that had otherwise been allied with, or suppress the natural organizing tendencies of the proletariat as being represented in the councils. As soon as you start have to cast your organization as the party, you're already in a sort of like a failed revolutionary moment to some extent. What you're actually trying to do, I mean, I suppose the example, I mean, to follow through to like the third stage of Phil Neal's like description of the Communist Party, is the third stage is the Communist Party, which he describes as eternal. But it is exactly what we've just been describing. It's this kind of like thing that is both singular and multiple at the same time. It's sort of like ISO coalescing of all of these different organizations, but can be considered to have some kind of, I guess, totalizing coherence as well. It's a sort of synthesis of the historical party and the sort of like the formal individual political organizations that could represent individual communist parties, I suppose.
Yeah, I expected that the Communist Party brackets eternal to be capital C, capital P, but he makes pains to be like, it is not capital C, capital P. It is lowercase c, lowercase p. And it's interesting because on one hand,
when do you ever talk about lowercase Communist Party?
Yeah, I know, exactly. Listen, we don't want to take any of the responsibility. We're lowercase, you know what I mean? But it's an interesting one because there is this kind of like, dare I say, Dan, dialectical kind of interplay between the kind of formal party and the historical party that is supposed to be, in Neel's kind of like understanding, the thing that kind of coalesces into the old lowercase Communist Party, you know, which I think is I think is a really interesting way of kind of understanding communist organizing. But then, you know, on the other hand, it's interesting to kind of try and balance that with the idea that he puts forward, which is that Communist Party, eternal, lowercase, should never like subordinate itself to the capital C communist capital P party. And it's a really interesting one. It's like, well, that's very much easier said than done, right? Because it's like, you know, frequently insurgencies or revolts or something like that kind of do need to kind of coalesce around a, you know, all caps group or something like that to actually make a push like that happen. But I mean, maybe that's just like I don't, and well, I'll finish that thought. And maybe that's just kind of like, at that point, how are you supposed to kind of like not coalesce around one organization, one group? But maybe that's just kind of like a misunderstanding or a lack of imagination about what a modern day communist rebellion would actually look like, because maybe you wouldn't want it to actually be like, okay, and now we'll coalesce around this one group who will do a putsch for us. They'll do a coup, and we'll all just sit back and be told where to go and what to do and what to work and, you know, shit like that. Like, it's interesting. It's like, I don't know if I fully understand necessarily yet how you're not supposed to subordinate a communist party to a communist party, if that makes sense. It's very difficult to talk about these things out loud. You know what I mean? But like, I don't know if I fully understand that.
No, I mean, it's an important question, and I hadn't really considered the potential necessity of having to do that, particularly like, you know, revolutionary situations always come up against, you know, counter-revolutionary ones, and, you know, there are revolutions often have like terror phases, whether we want to like condone them or not. I suppose there's a degree to which what's really being talked about here is, I guess you could potentially have subordination to a capital T, capital C, you know, the Communist Party. I'm running out of letters. Capital P, capital C, capital P, Communist Party. But I guess that organization could then contain a whole load of formal organizations that have a degree of independence. You know, you don't necessarily have to suppress factions within your political party. And then I guess also there is the case that what Neel is talking about here as being the Communist Party, eternal, whatever, it also contains all of the organizations of the working class, all of the councils, all of the nascent organizations that are going to be the bedrock of how socialist society organizes itself. You know, like the capital C, capital P Communist Party isn't going to represent like, socialist society. It's all of the social organizations of society that, you know, go toward contributing toward, I don't know, constructing that society, which are going to be society. Words that word got completely garbled words there. Apologies,
Capital
but
S society.
hopefully it's obvious. So the point that I'm trying to make is that, like, the Communist Party is not just formal political organizations, but all social organizations that are operating under the new revolutionary conditions, and are seeking to create new revolutionary conditions, I guess.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, I think. And it's funny because I think that's something I've kind of like been critical of communization about before, which is like they are so on the money when it comes to like, communism needs to begin immediately in the revolution. But I've always been a bit critical of their kind of like understanding of what communism is, because it's very much a like, you know, a collective reproduction of society, which is true, but it's also like what, when it comes down to like a functioning political economy of what that would look like, it kind of seems like it falls down a little bit, because it's not actually talking about, how you validate everyone's labor as social, all of this stuff. Like, but I think you're absolutely right, right? It's like the Communist Party, I suppose, yeah, is all of these different organizations that come together to create communism. And I know that that seems like a truism, but it's like, I guess we need to remember that a communist revolution, and this is maybe what I was saying about lack of imagination, is like communist revolution isn't a political coup. I think hopefully every communist would be able to accept that, whether or not a Blanquist coup or a social democratic republic is part of their strategy. Hopefully they'd recognize that that isn't communism, right? I think a lot of people probably don't, but the point is that, like, communism, a communist revolution would be the communal seizing of the means of production and of communally reproducing all of society, and of making it so that, having a functioning political economy so that class wouldn't come back, you know? And I suppose in that sense, there is a real danger maybe of talking about the Communist Party all lowercase is beginning to speak in truisms, but like, to speak in truisms, yeah, that Communist Party is those organs that facilitate the communist reproduction of life. And, certain people will have strategic differences about how the Communist Party relates to that. But again, I think that might just be a lack of imagination, where it's like, you know, we were talking about this on an episode recently. It's like, just because that's how things went, and we need to be honest, like dramatically failed in the 20th century, it would be shocking if that's how they went again this time around. You know what I mean? In kind of any context, whether it's China, the Soviet Union, whatever, like, so yeah, it's an imagination thing, I guess. And it is about keeping your eye on the ball about what a communist revolution would be,
And I think Phil Neel seemingly is at pains to say that there has to be conditions for counting someone or something inside of the communist project as opposed to outside. There is always an outside, and I guess there's always a question of how you relate to the outside. There isn't any explicit mention of the dictatorship of the proletariat, but for me, there was a question of like, okay, what political conditions do you have to create to make it impossible for other social modes of operation not to exist, or to be sort of beginning to erode the conditions that make capitalism possible. And yeah, one of the interesting things in this also is Phil Neel trying to set conditions for how communist organizations, how communist parties, formal communist groupings should relate to one another. This is when he's talking about this kind of idea of the ecumenical nature of these organizations, to which I understand he means that we really need to avoid this kind of like ossified commitment to the past, this sort of commitment to replaying, or sort of attempting to recreate tactical successes of the past because they worked before, so they're going to work again, kind of thing. It's all of these, what you were describing before about where all the sects have come from, all of these myriad splits and these commitments to particular doctrinal sets of ideas that often stem from just one person and have become the kind of like cultish ideological leaders of a sect. And rather than looking to history and having all of these communist groupings stuck in the past, what they actually should do is like have a open-minded approach to the future and to this unfolding historical process that Phil Neel is trying to describe. And maybe this is the really utopia bit of it, but like, maybe you can build a communist ecology where enough of the formal parties have this similar approach, where there's a sort of a degree of mutual understanding and respect as well as difference between these groupings. And if you can instill that from the beginning, maybe that is what guards against one communist party taking over and subverting a revolution. But
I mean, yeah. I it's funny. It's like, what's more utopian? I mean, we're communists. Like, it's all utopian. I kind of hate it when people use the term utopian because it's like, it's like grow up. Like, but it's like realistically, in a derogatory sense, what's more utopian? What's being outlined here, or the idea that you can like change the American Constitution to benefit the proletariat? It's like both is the answer.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? It's like strategic differences or whatever, and a difference of interpretation in terms of what communism is. But it's interesting. I was trying to figure out, as I do with a lot of the communization, ultra lefty kind of stuff, like whether or not I was trying to think when I was reading it, whether or not this was optimistic or if it was pessimistic. I think it's fully optimistic. I think it's like a really interesting framing of like even all of the successive failures of the communist movement, as framing it as like, it's not kind of like and we're just all progressing towards this ultimate goal. But it is like with the historical party stuff is a really interesting way of understanding there are still the same core contradictions of capitalism, and people's core, beliefs and wants remain the same. It's like people deep down, everybody wants a classless society. You know what I mean? That's not a particularly controversial thing to say, I don't think. It's, it's just when we read workers' councils, I think Pennicook clarified this like hugely for me, just in that section where he said something like, when we talk about the class struggle, all it is it's a question of what's the phrase he used? Like self when you're trying to like protect yourself or look after yourself. What's the phrase? Like
self-preservation.
Self-preservation. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Thank you. He's like, it's just a question of self-preservation because, 99% of the time, self-preservation means not rebelling against capitalism. And he's like, it's not an immiseration thesis to think when self-preservation suddenly becomes battling with the police in the streets and setting up autonomous zones and all that shit, that is, the communist movement. Like, it's just broadly true, right? So I don't know. I think I came away from this thinking that this was quite an optimistic piece, and I appreciated it. If the optimism is coming from nowhere, if not, it's trust in our class, which is what realistically we should all have, right?
Yeah. I appreciate the sort of like small amounts of invariant conditions sprinkled in, and there's a sort of degree of cyclical phases of possibility. Maybe there's the maybe it's nice to have something where there's sort of an absence of calamity for a moment. Maybe the prospect of barbarism is there, but we don't always have to point at it. We could just like. We could just be optimistic of the possibilities, I guess.
Well, it's like the one of I don't remember if it was the last piece that he wrote before he died, but it's like the Mike Davis thing where he was like, realistically, when people ask me, do I have hope for the future? It's like, it kind of doesn't matter. It's kind of, and he's like, I don't really give a fuck if you're hopeful or if you're not hopeful. I just hope that you try, right? Like, yeah, barbarism is, it's looking at us. But like, realistically, should it change how you act if you were able to look into the future and be like, oh, it is just going to be barbarism? Hopefully not, right?
Yeah. That's a really good point. What does it change?
Yeah. Realistically, like, hopefully nothing. If you're a communist, like, still try. Like, and again, like, a large part of this, what I really appreciated is because so much of like, a lot of and this goes back to Marx, I think, like, so often socialists will try to take moralism out of the equation because, Marx was like in a lot of his contemporary political writings really trying to like react against what he saw as like utopian, well, like actual utopianism, like, you know, like whether it's kind of like English utopianism or like French moralism or something like that, and try to really create like a scientific project behind socialism. And I think that's unfortunately kind of manifested itself in like a series of kind of like gross ways where it's like, this isn't a moral question, this is a scientific question. But this strategy of the party, I think, really marries communist organizing with just helping people in a way that like anarchism, I don't think, has necessarily really ever been able to do. And communism hasn't been able to do. Marxism maybe just like for the reverse of that, because it's too up itself, right? It's like a formal party is you pushing like, you know, a committee group for your local neighborhood in a communist direction. Like, it was cool. I appreciated that.
Mm-hmm. I like there's a degree to which there's some degree of religiosity sprinkled through this as well. You know, it's like I quite like the idea that there's some amount of faith necessary. You know, you are a believer, and you have to have some amount of faith in something. Yeah, I don't know. That's all I have to say, really.
We like faith here. We like faith here. Only other thing, I guess, is just kind of going back a little bit where he talks about the subsistence struggle stuff. Mm-hmm. This is just more so, I would say, like interesting for like tactical reasons, because he kind of talks about how Marxists or communists, when we're organizing, need to necessarily go into subsistence struggles, which are both the necessary sites of where we have to organize, but also something to be overcome, because they still kind of like valorize the proletariat as a class, as opposed to trying to get past its class. Still, though, you still need to organize them for a million different reasons. But he kind of splits these up into two different groups, where he talks about the term struggles over the terms of subsistence, and then struggles over the imposition of these terms. And so, you know, the first one, terms of subsistence, he's kind of talking about like relatively easy to predict struggles, maybe at least with a little bit of hindsight, like looking at price fluctuations. Like, you know, we started this by talking about fuel protests in Ireland, right? Like, you know, price fluctuations and supply and demand fluctuations due to the war have created, you know, a relatively predictable set of unease amongst all people in countries where they get their oil predominantly from these places. And then, you know, imposition of these terms, these are much harder to predict. This is kind of like dignity in the workplace, but then also like survival, you know, like Black Lives Matter, things like that, like the George Floyd uprising, all those things. And yeah, they're interesting because he kind of talks about how you get a mass uprising when these two things kind of like come together and then overspill their bounds into something that he calls very self-reflexive and very like, you know, emergent, I would say, from those struggles, where it's like prices are too much. And when we're protesting, a cop killed somebody. So now there's a mass uprising. And now that mass uprising becomes about something more than just the original price increase or the original like state sanctioned murder, right? Like it's interesting. And an interesting tactical way of kind of thinking about subsistence struggles is like, yeah, okay, they're not communists, they're not building councils, but like get over yourself. Like you still need to organize in them to necessarily overcome them, right?
And I guess there's an extent to which it's not to say that a solution can't be found within capitalism, but it's always going to come. Capitalism is always going to fail eventually to solve these problems. And given that people exist under capitalism, they live under capitalism, we're always going to structure their resistance under conditions that they recognize and understand before they start breaking out and looking for something new and, you know, creating revolutionary potential. So, yeah, that the recognition, particularly as like so much of this essay is that relationship between the small and the local, and how those sort of local particular things add up to a more singular and global movement, I guess. Yeah, I don't know, and you know, those local struggles are always going to be, as you say, these sort of start as some kind of potentially reformist political effort that, you know, needs to go beyond, and we need to go beyond, kind of thing. Just create a bit of a dilemma where he says that like sometimes a victory in these struggles is actually a loss, because like if there is a success, then it forecloses the possibility of going beyond capitalist conditions. But yeah, it seems true to say that it's the necessary site that sort of communists ought to be engaged in, I guess.
Yeah, and I think broadly, even across like the communist spectrum, most people recognize that, right?
Yeah.
If for even not just like egotistical reasons of like kind of like embarrassing, like, you know, when you go to a Palestine protest and there are people like, you know, trying to sell their culty newspaper. It's like,
Yeah.
you know, feels a bit self-important sometimes, but you know, most people recognize this. It's interesting too. It's like an interesting kind of solution to like organizer burnout too, right? Where it's, you know, yeah, you're not going to win every battle. In fact, you're going to lose almost every single one. And you would actually probably be very lucky to live to see, you know, that war eventually being won in its totality, right? So it's like, you know, you're organizing these places like this self-reflexivity, this kind of emergent change that becomes a mass uprising, like you got to recognize that's like fully outside of the control of any communist party, uppercase or lowercase. You know what I mean? Like these things are going to happen. We can do our best to try and like organize them and to bring them about. But like, hey, you know, at the end of the day, like don't beat yourself up if your subsistence struggle fails. You know, it's like, it probably will. Like, yeah.
The only other thing, maybe I'll say because it had quite a big impact on me, perhaps, was this argument that I guess political struggles don't start with writing a program. They don't start with I guess it's like you don't start with the political formal organization, and I feel like maybe in the sort of like present ebb of if we are indeed in an ebb of sort of resistance to capitalism, but like it's quite easy to imagine that we just need to form the right kind of political party. We need to write the right kind of, we need to write the correct political program, and then we need to learn how to propagandize this to the working class, and that's how we'll win them over. And those, I guess, are necessarily skills, and it's an important thing to have. But if we, particularly as if we're at risk of writing political programs predicated on our inheritance from our sort of communist forebears, rather than recognizing that the political programs of today have to be written around political contemporary struggles and contemporary conditions, but also people's commitment to a political project doesn't come from, you know, reading the right pamphlet or reading the right newspaper or hearing the right speech necessarily. It comes from again, I don't know, like an engagement with a historical process and a sort of a recognition of a possibility and an engagement with a new truth that embodies a, you know, a potential communist faith in them. So it's like, yeah, rearrange, adding a degree of skepticism to some aspects of socialist organizing, and reminding us to bear in mind that some other things are necessary, perhaps, I guess.
Yeah, and this is the stuff. I'm glad you brought that up because this is the stuff that came that I remember most from Hinterland is when he was talking about those like dumb fucking like patriot groups, predominantly in the western part of the United States, and he quotes some, you know, prick bourgeois military strategist when they're talking about like competitive control, and he makes the point, which is exactly what you're saying, right? Which is like ideology very much follows kind of a like, I wrote down the phrase here. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to find it, but it was, you know, it very much follows the ability of a group to seemingly be able to provide meaningful change and to have a like strength of purpose and of organization, and to like offer people something, which again gets back to like what we were saying at the very beginning of this conversation, which is like, what are these groups offering? Like a political program that remains very opinionated and subjective. And, you know, even worse than that, it's like telling people that the person at the stall opposite them is wrong and that they're right. It's like, okay, double whammy. You're like not offering anybody anything and you're coming across like a prick. It's like nobody's going to listen to you. Like, yeah, it's competitive control. It's like, what are you offering? Can you do anything about it? And that, you know, that ties into this, you know, Neel's idea of like the formal party, about like informal or formal groupings of people who are like going about activities that are communist measures, you know, to speak in kind of roundabout terms. Like, Yeah, as opposed to just trying to like hit people over the head with newspaper for the socialist workers or whatever at a Palestine rally, right? It's like, yeah, there you go.
Don't do that.
Don't do that. Yeah, or whatever.
I do. Yeah.
Cool. Great. Back in the saddle. Back podcasting again. Look at that.
Yeah, it's been fun.
It's been fun. All right. Great, Dan. I forget how we end these things.
We'll so I don't know. We'll be back with something another time. We'll be back with something another time. And then normally I awkwardly like thank people.
But and then I awkwardly go, bye.
Yeah, I'm grateful. Yeah. Thanks, Jack.
All right, see ya. Hey everybody, Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there. Or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.